Hello from Cork.
Hello from New York.
It's Misha Moira Shanachie Corky. It's Maria, the Cork-based storyteller.
It's me, Jim, here in Fayetteville, New York.
We can't wait to tell you a few stories.
Jim, I can't wait to hear your story this time.
I have a story set in Eastern Europe. It's another one of my Jewish stories, but it's one of my favorites. There was this young man, and he and his wife had been married for several years. And as is often the case in these stories, they didn't have any children, and they really wanted children.
Mm.
And the man was a devotee, a Hassid of this famous fellow, the Maggid of Kuznets. And he was known to make potions that would cure any problem. The Hassid's wife kept saying to him, ask your teacher, get a potion for us. And he was just too embarrassed. He didn't want to bring it up. And she pushed and she pushed and she pushed. And finally, she said, you know what? I'll ask him myself. So she made her way to the Maggid of Kuznets, and he was, of course, ready to help until he heard what the problem was. And he said, this is not a problem that can be solved with a potion. You need to bring your husband in here, and we need to have a talk. So she brought her husband in, who was just embarrassed beyond words. And the Maggid told the two of them, I don't know exactly what your problem is or what the solution for it is, but I know who knows. And I know this much, that for you to do whatever it is that he's going to ask you to do, you are going to have to make a huge sacrifice. And the couple looked at each other. He said, you're going to have to sell everything you own. And he looked at the wife, he said, you're going to have to go live with your parents as if you were divorced. And you, said to the Hassid, you're going to have to take all the money that you make from selling everything you own. You can't spend a penny of it. And you're going to have to take it to this great man, the Seer of Lublin, who lives a week's walk away. You'll have to get there without paying for food or transportation. You're just going to have to walk and fast the whole way. And he said to the couple, now you go talk about it and you decide if this is something you want to do. And the two of them went home, and they had probably the most difficult conversation they've ever had. But they decided this was worth it. So they sold everything they had. She went to live with her parents, and he made his way off with a bag of 300 rubles. That's all they could get. And he made his way to the Seer of Lublin. He begged for food along the way, but he didn't spend a kopeck of it. Finally, he gets to the Seer of Lublin's door. And he goes up to knock at his door, and the door opens as he's walking up. And Seer looks out, and he says, you're finally here. And he says, what do you mean? He says, I know why you're here. Come on in. And he comes in and he sits down, and the Seer looks at him and he says, this is all about Miriam. Now, the Hassid was confused because his wife's name was Chava. So how could this be about Miriam? He didn't know anyone named Miriam. And the Seer looked at him and said, you don't even remember her name, do you? And all of a sudden, his heart started pounding, and he remembered. Miriam. He had been betrothed to Miriam as a young boy. And when they grew up and it was time for them to get married, he didn't want to marry her. And he left her and he abandoned her. And the vow that was made for their wedding was broken. He had forgotten. Somehow he had forgotten. You know how that happens. Sometimes we do something we're not proud of and we forget about it. Well, that's what happened to this man. And so he's looking at the Seer of Lublin and he says, well, what? So this is why we don't have children. What do I do about it? And he said, well, you have to go find Miriam and you have to get her forgiveness for breaking your vow. Well, that was years and years and years ago. How will I ever find her? And the seer said, it's not my problem. You have to find her. And the man stood up and with a heavy heart, he started to leave. And then he said, oh, I've got these 300 rubles. And he put them down on the seer's desk, in payment for his help. And the seer looked at him. He said, no, those aren't for me. You're going to need those. And be sure you don't spend any. And so now the chassid leaves and he doesn't know where to look. But he knows there's a fair coming a few days away, and it's coming the next week. It's one of those summer fairs that people come and they spend a whole week at. He thought, surely she'll come there. So he starts to head off to this fair. And just like before, he's walking, he's begging for food. He'll find occasionally someone will give him a place to spend the night. And he makes it to the fair. Now, he has no idea what Miriam looks like. So he's just asking everyone, does anyone know this Miriam? And nobody knows who she is. And day passes after day, and nights are getting harder and harder. And here he is surrounded by all these people and all this delicious smelling food, and he can't spend a kopeck. And finally, it's the last day of the fair. And wouldn't you know, it's raining like mad. He's standing under an awning. There's hardly anyone around because it's a miserable day. And he looks across the way, and there under another awning is this amazing woman. She's dressed all in white. She has a servant who's holding an umbrella over her head. And he thinks, maybe she'll know. She looks like she knows everybody. So he starts to make his way over to her. And as he gets close, she turns to her servant and she says, there he is. I'll bet he doesn't remember my name. And he realizes this is Miriam. Now, all this time has gone by. He's been fasting. He's been regretting. His heart is broken over what he did and forgot about. And so when he finally reaches her, he drops down to the ground and he says, Miriam, Miriam, I'm so sorry for what I did to you. There's no excuse. Can you ever forgive me? Because you see, he didn't even care about the child now. He was consumed with the regret that he had for the vow he had broken. And she looks down at him and she can see that he's serious, but she's still injured. And she says, you know what? I'll tell you what. You seem to be serious, but I'll give you a test. My brother lives 2 towns from here, and he is very poor. And his daughter wants to marry the man she loves, but he can't afford the dowry. If you will go pay the dowry for it, then I'll know you're serious, and then I'll forgive you. And he says, of course, I'll do whatever I can. And she tells him where to look for her brother. And he falls, his head hits the ground. He's so grateful that she has given him this path. And when he finally looks up, the rain and the tears streaming down his face, she's already left. So he starts his path to find her brother. And he goes and he has to walk another couple of days. And there, as he enters the town, he sees this man sitting by the edge of the road, his head lowered. He's clearly upset. And he said, would you be Miriam's brother? He said, yes, I am. Why do you ask? And he says, I understand that your daughter wants to be married, but you don't have the money for the dowry. And the brother says, yes, everybody knows that. Why are you saying that? Are you trying to hurt me more? And the Hussein says, no. I was speaking to your sister, and she asked me to help. And here, I have 300 rubles for you. And the brother looks at him. He says, well, that's exactly the amount of the dowry, but what took you so long? And the Hussein says, well, I just saw her 2 days ago. I couldn't have come here any faster. And the brother says, now I know you're lying. She's been dead 10 years. And in that moment, they both heard a voice. And the voice said, I forgive you. And it was her voice. And so the Hassid went to the wedding of Miriam's niece. And from there, the story continues.
Oh, Jim, what a beautiful story. So rich, you know.
Yeah.
How old is that story, Jim?
This version of it is probably, a couple hundred years old, maybe 250.
Yeah.
It's a variation of a lot of different ghost stories, of course, but this one is tied to some particular individuals. So we'd say about 250 years old. Yeah.
250 years old.
Yeah.
A lot of wisdom in it, you know.
A lot of wisdom.
Yeah, we need the wise stories now.
We do.
So, yeah, you know. So, you know, some of my own work is that we make stories. I was recently in Germany and I was working with a lot of kids from the age of 8 years old up to the age of 14. And this was the last story that I made in Germany. We made 2 or 3 stories a day. This is the last one that I made just before I came home, and it was with the 14-year-olds. And we did a deep dive, you know. So sometimes you're kind of lightly looking at maybe the character, the environment, the mission, that kind of thing. But we spent a lot of time looking at the characters and the environment. And I noticed the timbre of the story was different. And it kind of made me, you know, it made me have a graw for looking at stories in that way, you know, for diving deep into stories. So I thought I would share that story with you today.
Please do.
So there was once a girl and her name was Rosemary. She was born in a place called Mythica. Mythica, like its name, was a very mythical place. It was full of high mountains, some of them dark, some of them light, and there was loads of mist around the place, giving it like a magical air. She remembered in her youth that the castles were all different colours and all different glows. So sometimes they would glow very bright and sometimes they would be darker in themselves, like people. Some people like to be very extroverted and some people like to look inwards. But when she was very young, her mother passed away And then everything started to be different. Everything was darker, and it seemed to get darker every year. And it seemed that all of the life began to leach out of Mythica. Now, she was quite old when this story was told. She was 140 years old, but she was one of these magical beings, who can transform themselves into any way they want to look. And she would take on the look of a 16-year-old maiden with long red hair. She had a ready smile. And when she was out in the world, Jim, people loved to be her friend. She was caring, she was funny, she was adventurous, and no matter where she went, she made friends easily. But she always stayed around that age because that was the age that she had lost her mother. And it was very rare that she would go back to Mythica, maybe twice in a century. At the time of the story, she's 140 years old, and she's going back to Mythica for her third ever visit since she's left. And she's absolutely distraught at what she sees. The mountains look as if they are in permanent night. The dark castles have become darker still. There's no light at all, like a black hole that you would see in space. And even the big black castle that she had been born in, with all of the love and light of her mother, well, that seemed to be one of the darkest of all. She stayed there one night, and it was so sorrowful to her that it was so changed that she went for a walk down the mountains until she saw that there was a little stone cottage, a tiny bit lit up, as if at twilight, because the sun was able to make its way through the dense leaves, a dappled light. And there she saw a smiling woman, and the woman told her that things were different in Mythica now, that there was a toxic time traveller, and every time he came, the world got a little bit darker, a little bit danker, a little bit colder, and that he was here at the moment. So they were all being very careful, and she advised her to be careful too. And she said, why don't you stay with me in this little stone cottage with my family? And she said, why do the animals glow? And she said, we don't know, but they started to glow when the world got darker. And at first, all of the animals had this beautiful violet glow. But over time, it dimmed to a kind of a blue colour, almost like night. And she said, those animals you don't want to call into you because it seems they are being infected by the darkness and the coldness and the boldness of what is happening that we can't explain. And she said, oh, that's awful sorrowful. And then she put her hands out, palms first, and her hands lit up, and they were a kind of a golden colour. And it reminded her of the light of her mother, and she started to laugh out loud. And she said, oh, look, I'm bringing a little bit of light to this place. And as she said it, the animals began to gather around, and they lent their light to her light. And the light became like a globe, and it began to get bigger and larger, and the people started to smile again. At that moment, the toxic time traveller came out to the front door of her castle and took a step forward. And she looked at him, and he looked at her. And the way he walked looked familiar, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. And then he stood out into her light, the light that she had made with the palms of her hand and the globe of the animals. And she saw that it was her father. Oh my goodness, the toxic time traveller was her father. You see, when her mother had passed, he had lost all of his light, all of his heart, and he could only look backwards, and he could only be bitter. And he gave himself over to the bitterness. And as he watched his daughter, she dropped her hands with the shock, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing. And the old woman said, please, please don't leave the darkness come back into the world again. Will you help us? And she came over to the little girl, And as she put her hand on her shoulder, a kind of ghost of her mother came into a globe and floated down from the tree and stood near her daughter and put her hand on the shoulder of her daughter, who felt 16 now, even though she was 140 years old. For we are all young in the face of our parents. And they looked at the father, and his heart began to melt, and the darkness began to leave him. But as it did, so did his life force. And this blue spirit rose from where he had fallen and came down the mountain to join the mother. And their golden light lit up that world, just like the sun, before they floated off. And now in Mythica, Rosemary lives in that castle in remembrance of this important lesson, and everybody tells her story. And that is the story of 9A from Thomas More Gymnasium in Down in Germany.
Beautiful,
A
beautiful.
wise story from
A
14-year-old.
wise story.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
And many stories within it, really.
absolutely. You know, I mean, I gathered many stories over the week, but I remember that one. I just felt very connected to that story. I loved it so much. Yeah. And it was lovely to witness it being born from our ancient ways of making stories together, the threading and the weaving, you know. 'Tis a real honor to be in this work.
It is. And there's a special beauty that young souls bring to this work. They see things and they say them in ways that are both clear and deep at times. Yeah.
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 You know, and it feels also that it's kind of archetypal, that before we get too defended by the world, that we're open to these stories and lessons and messages, you know. Yeah. So I really liked that one.
I'd love to just explore it for a moment. This group that you were working with, what exposure had they had to this kind of work before? Was this their first time? Was it something they had been doing for a while?
I've been working with them now for 5 years and they're 14 now. So I suppose I would have gotten them first when they were 9, you know. And when I first came to the school, they hadn't really gathered their stories in a very long time in the village. So I was like, what are the stories of this area? And they had no sense of that. But then they went out and they began asking the elder population. And there's amazing stories of cities under local lakes and, you know, how red wine was made from a goat and this kind of thing. So there's a real richness there, you know. And of course, the Grimm's tales come from Germany, you know.
Sure,
So I was,
sure.
yeah, you know. So, but for these young people, I think they really get a lot out of making stories as well as telling. And they're bilingual. So this is not, English is not their first language,
Uh-huh.
you know. So there's something special about that as well.
You know, and I'm just thinking about how those two stories come together. And it has to do with a loss that had been forgotten, but not forgotten. And it had to find its way out.
So in mine, it was the father, and also the, you know, the liminal space of being connected to the death space, the dark words, because in the story that 9A made, until things were resolved, there couldn't be any border between the dark worlds and this world, you know. And it was the same in
Right.
your story, you know.
Yes,
So
yes, yes.
yeah.
And in each case, the darkness has to be embraced, not accepted in the sense
Yeah.
of not, oh, this is what we're stuck with for the rest of our lives, but
Yeah.
we have to embrace it. We can't just deny it.
Yeah. And, you know, the melting of the bitterness had to be earned. It wasn't a case of you could, kind of, there was a whole process to that happening. And I think we could learn from that,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
even in my own country here in Ireland, in our peace process that happened in my lifetime, that wasn't something that could happen in a day. It had to be talked through. It had to be worked on,
Couldn't just tell the story of the happy ending.
Exactly.
That wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's something about these stories that are very connecting and, something that is very satisfying, that a journey happened and that an earning happened. The melting was earned. Yeah.
That makes me think at this time in this country, there's a big film event, and that is the release of the second part of the Wicked story, which is a retooling of The Wizard of Oz. And what's interesting to me is they took this revised story of The Wizard of Oz, which was very successful on Broadway, and they turned it into over 6 hours of a movie. It was so long they had to break it into 2 parts. And the story itself is about confronting both the ambiguities of what's right and wrong, but also realizing what's really right and wrong and how does one stand up for what's truly right.
Yeah.
The first movie was the first half of the story, and it's all light and sweet and is lots of, I'll just call them pink ribbons and bows. So anyway, the first half of the story was all this sweetness and light and beautiful music and happy stuff going on, and only kind of hinting at the challenges that the second half was going to undertake. And the movie was just, people loved it. It was so wonderful. And then the second movie came out, and it's full of challenges. It's full of how do people confront these difficult topics. And the critics said, it's not nearly as good as a movie as the first. Well, I will tell you, we decided we really wanted to see the second movie. So we watched the first movie over again. And I looked at my wife and I said, this is just so sickly sweet. Why would we want to watch another 3 hours of the same thing that people say isn't even as good? But we watched it. It was wonderful because it wasn't sweet.
Yeah.
It was heartfelt. It was challenging. It was, what is it that really propels us to the good, to the true good? So these two stories remind me of that, because the story comes when we face our challenges, not when we wrap them up in a bow and think that everything's beautiful.
Yeah. And the world is a bit like that. Little battles that we won, that we've taken for granted for a number of years, are now being called into question again. And people are thinking about that. So there seems to be a zeitgeist. And I think the stories are a little anchor in that, and a lovely way of discussing those challenges,
That's right. Because we can talk about the stories and we don't have to take sides. We can say, ooh, this is an interesting challenge.
Yeah, makes them safe.
Will we say goodbye from Cork?
And goodbye from New York, but only for a while, because we'll be back again with another episode. Absolutely.
We can't wait to see you on the Story Road one more time. And from this time till that, be safe on the Story Road.